Although they're one of the most famous civilizations in history, most of us don't actually know the nitty-gritty details of Viking life, circa 800 AD. But for a society that's thought to be so vulgar, researchers keep finding more and more evidence that proves we've got it all wrong. Some of the Vikings' accomplishments seem positively modern, while others, well, see for yourself. New historical artifact exposes odd details about Viking life. Vikings never actually called themselves Vikings. In Old Norse, Viking was a word meaning a pirate raid, so the Scandinavians would use the phrase going Viking when speaking of raiders. Over time, however, the word became prolifically used as a noun. Vikings never wore horned helmets. The common misconception may have started when 19th century painters depicted these warriors with horned headpieces based on defamatory descriptions from northern Europeans. Their fertility goddess, Freya, was known to have a chariot pulled by two slate-colored cats, and felines were kept around to eliminate pests, as well as act as furry companions to feline-friendly Vikings. To start fires, Vikings boiled a fungus, called Fomes fomentarius, in human urine for a few days. Then they clobbered that urine-soaked fungus until it had a felt-like texture and started to spark. The sodium nitrate in urine allowed for the fungus char cloth to smolder for days, and we're sure the fire smelled just lovely. According to history, the Vikings valued physical strength a lot. Because they depended on their physical health as a means for a self-sufficient lifestyle, as well as for survival in general, if children were born sickly or with any physical disabilities, they abandoned them. Pieces of skiing devices discovered in 1960 dated back to 6000 BC. Not only was it a fast way to get around, but Vikings also used skis for competitive sport. They enjoyed it so much that they worshipped Ullr, who was a literal god of skiing. Despite being portrayed as gruff and filthy, Vikings were a pretty clean band. Artifacts show they made tweezers, razors, combs and ear cleaners from both animal bones and antlers. History reported they bathed weekly and went swimming in hot springs. Vikings painted their shields, but it had nothing to do with decoration or sentimentality. It was to hide the wood grain. Although wood isn't the strongest material to take cover behind, the paint helps seal the material and prevent it from cracking. The designs also help the warriors tell friend from foe in the heat of battle. Some of history's best shipbuilders, Vikings are most known for their longship design, which was motored by a combo of manpower and wind. Longships were adopted by many other cultures and acted as a shipbuilding guideline for centuries. Some Vikings were absolutely berserk, no, literally. Elite warriors were known as berserkers. They wore animal pelts in battle and fought in a drug and alcohol-induced trance-like fury. Appropriately, this is where the word berserk comes from. Every now and again, Vikings donned eyeliner made from crushed antimony, burnt almonds, lead, oxidized copper, ash, and soft semi-precious stones. Besides the desire for a glamorous smoky eye look, the liner actually protected their vision from the sun's glare. Most Norse communities lived peaceful farming lives, growing oats, barley, and wheat to make flour, porridge, and ale. They also cultivated vegetables such as onions, beans, and cabbage, and owned livestock such as pigs, sheep, goats, cattle, geese, and chickens. History reported recent genetic confirmation that a Viking warrior, which was a high-status position, could often be a woman. Researchers at Stockholm and Uppsala universities found more evidence. These researchers found several battle weapons, 2 horses, and a full game board set buried in the grave of a female Viking skeleton. The game board was an indication that she was a high-ranking combatant with knowledge of strategies. Scandinavian Viking women could own property and demand for divorce. If their husbands passed, they were expected to become the new providers of their household, which unbelievably granted them economic opportunities as traders and farmers. The most prized possession a Viking could own was a sword. A symbol of wealth, the intricate craftsmanship that went into making a blade made them wildly expensive, especially considering they were a tool used for protection. Most Vikings couldn't afford swords, however. Vikings both feared and worshipped Valkyries, who, in Norse mythology, were powerful female beings praised by the powerful sky god Odin. The Valkyrie warriors, or chooser of the slain, decided who was destined to live in battle and who was destined to die. Known to enjoy an alcoholic beverage now and again, Vikings consumed a ton of mead, which consists of 3 later fermented ingredients: honey, yeast, and water. Honey was actually the only sweetener known to the Norse. Vikings traded for slaves to help maintain their farms, which they called thralls. Unfortunately, human trafficking was also a popular economic trade for the Vikings, as many of them acquired wealth by abducting young boys and women from several areas in northern Europe. Can't we just talk about cats again? Vikings horizontally filed down and put little notches into their teeth. Anthropologists suggest the markings could represent an achievement or simply just embellishment. When they viciously raided Ireland about 1,000 years ago, it's possible Vikings ever so generously brought leprosy along with them. Strains of the infectious skin disease found in human remnants in Dublin were extremely similar to those linked to medieval Scandinavia. And contagious ailments and enemy raids were only 2 of the most bizarre aspects of a medieval peasant's life. What were peasant homes like? They were small structures with thatched roofs, designed to be easy to repair. Serfs called these little dwellings cruck houses. No matter the weather, they weren't very comfortable places to be. Winters were harsh, and summers were unbearably hot. And instead of a dog curled up at the end of their beds, peasants did things a bit differently. Whatever animals peasants owned were rounded up at night and brought inside with the rest of the family. Cows, pigs, chickens, all would crowd into the cruck house for a few different reasons. First was the risk of animal theft. Leaving your critters outside was gambling whether they'd be there in the morning. Though, that wasn't the only potential problem. Sometimes the animals ran off all on their own. Losing your animals was a huge blow to a peasant family. Living with your livestock and farm animals wasn't easy. In fact, it was just as filthy as you'd expect. Flies, fleas, lice, you name it, peasants in medieval Europe scratched and swatted them as they slept. When they weren't working the land at all hours, peasants were paying hefty amounts of taxes. Yet, even the serfs. No one was exempt when the taxman called. Officials accepted forms of non-cash currency, like seeds, which weren't exactly cheap. Sacrificing seeds meant you'd have less to plant. Needless to say, this wasn't a sustainable cycle. In medieval Europe, sleep was handled much differently. Rather than retiring to bed for the night, peasants broke hours of sleep into smaller increments. They'd snooze for 2 to 4 hours, only to wake up and do other activities, like work, have sex, or even leave the house to visit friends. Then, they'd go back home to bed for a few more hours. Just when a peasant had a moment to rest from the seemingly never-ending labor of working their own land, they had to do the same for the church. That's right, in addition to the forced labor owed to lords, the church also had unflinching rules about sweat equity. Though this unpaid work was done without complaint, not participating was considered a sin. At the end of a back-breaking week was Sunday, a peasant's only day off. That day was relegated to the church, where, beyond worship, was an opportunity to sing and play music. In some cases, the church offered reading lessons to peasant children. Still, outside of their faith, peasants had a few additional bright lights in their difficult lives. Think exposing children to gory movies is bad? Well, in the Middle Ages, a typical family outing involved attending a bear baiting. Crowds gathered to witness dogs attack a chained bear, who would ultimately be freed and execute the canines. But for those not interested in bear versus dog battles to the death, there was the other popular pastime of cockfighting, or even a version of soccer, which wasn't much better. Football, or soccer, was a hugely popular game amongst medieval peasants, but you had to be willing to get hurt. Games lasted days and were punctuated by broken bones, unchecked aggression, and sometimes death. Things grew so bad that in 1363 King Edward III made playing soccer an imprisonable offense. Violence wasn't something peasants enjoyed by any means, but it was a huge problem, and it's not difficult to see why. Physical punishment was a socially acceptable response. Domestic violence in marriage was normalized, despite contradicting codes of chivalry. Other times, violence was born out of extreme financial desperation. Options were limited and tensions were high, so they eventually boiled over. The lower classes of Middle Ages society weren't ones to put up with injustice quietly. Peasants organized and attended protests against a man, and while some wildly waved pitchforks and other weapons, most showed up surprisingly well prepared. They cited their rights from the Domesday Book as evidence, despite lacking formal education. Ultimately, though, these protests were met with swift and brutal ends. The worst part about living in the lowest tier of medieval society was the lack of rights. If someone pointed the finger at a peasant, or worse, a serf, living a life of slavery, the accused was at the mercy of the punisher. Serfs were valued for labor, so they usually would be whipped rather than maimed or killed. In some severe cases, the punishment was brutal and cruel, like live burial. Water was even more valuable in the Middle Ages for its wide array of uses. The first stop in a peasant's morning was the nearby water source, probably a river, where they dumped their putrid bucket of human waste. Ah, how refreshing. If you're questioning whether their waste went straight into their drinking and bathing water, the answer is a grotesque absolutely. However, bathing itself was a whole other issue. Running water wasn't yet an amenity in medieval times, so even the societal elites were far from fresh as daisies. The situation was way stinkier for peasants. Some historians say that in their lifetimes, a typical peasant bathed only twice. Once at birth, the other after death. However, for those looking to wash, there was one rough option. Peasants searching for a rare scrub went to the stews, or what we'd call a public bath today. They stripped down and simmered together in the water, though admittedly, most didn't go there for hygiene. The stews were mostly known as a brothel, a hub for public sex and for thieves. It was a treasure trove for pickpockets to rifle through the clothes that bathers cast aside. Helicopter parents be warned. The lives of peasant children will make you sad. It was a feat for babies to survive beyond 6 months, so each year was counted as a small victory. Schooling was out of the question for children in this rung of society. Instead, they went straight to work, albeit doing more minor tasks like chasing away birds. While so often throughout history, women were so oppressed that they weren't allowed to participate in certain aspects of society, that wasn't the case in the Middle Ages. Peasant women, in particular, were very busy. No, it wasn't a highly progressive society, but women, especially on the lower rungs, held a lot of responsibility. What was on the menu for a typical family dinner? It depended on what was available. A grain, usually bread, was the mainstay of all their meals. Beans were another staple along with some salted meats, though meat was a luxury few could afford. Given their filthy conditions and limited resources, peasants had the shortest life expectancy of anyone in the rigid class structure of medieval society. The Black Death was the major culprit, killing 25 million people in a span of 5 years, and since serfs lived only an estimated 35 years on average, it's fair to say many of those deaths were the poorest of the poor. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.